My parents humiliated me at the will reading until they saw I inherited all, and they collapsed. The only sound in the room was the scratch of Harold Knox's pen as he signed the final page. Just seconds earlier, my father had declared, loud enough for every second cousin and junior attorney to hear, "She's just here because it's protocol. Let's not drag this out." He didn't bother looking at me. Neither did my mother. I had taken the seat at the end of the long walnut table because it was the only one left when I arrived. But something told me I would have been pushed there anyway, even if I'd come first. My name is Sophie Turner. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 7 years, I've lived a mostly quiet life in Seattle, running a small architecture studio that focuses on affordable housing and historic renovations. We're not flashy. We've never been featured in any glossy magazine. But we've helped restore 6 community buildings that would have otherwise been torn down. That's the kind of work that fills me, even if no one in my family ever understood it. I was born into the Turner family, a line of real estate magnates rooted in Savannah, Georgia. The kind of family that donates libraries for press coverage, then forgets to visit them. My father, David Turner, controls half the coastline along the riverfront. My mother, Elizabeth, was once a respected art history professor, but gave up teaching to focus on philanthropy and preserving Turner legacy. My younger brother, Julian, is what you might call a digital aristocrat. He burned through his startup inheritance in 3 years and reinvented himself as an online brand consultant. My sister Clara, the eldest, is a partner at a Manhattan law firm, divorced once, remarried well, still uses phrases like strategic proximity in casual conversation. I don't blame them for not understanding me for a long time. I didn't either. I thought I'd end up in the family business like everyone else. But during my final year at MIT, I interned with a firm restoring fire-damaged row houses in Detroit. And something shifted. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt necessary. That summer, I realized I didn't want to build new empires. I wanted to save what already mattered. When I told my parents I wouldn't be joining Turner Holdings after graduation, my mother said she'd prayed it was a phase. My father didn't speak to me for 4 months. At the time, I thought it was distance. Now I know it was dismissal. From then on, I became the outlier, the artsy one, the idealist with a soft heart and no strategy. That was the family script. I stopped trying to rewrite it. The only person who ever looked at me differently was my grandfather, Henry Knox, my mother's father. He was an architect in his youth before being pulled into the Turner fold through marriage and pressure. He used to say architecture was his original language, before silence became his safest one. When I was 10, he gave me a drafting set for Christmas while everyone else got designer things from Bloomingdale's. When I was 20, he mailed me a first edition of The Timeless Way of Building by Christopher Alexander with a note that simply read, "I see you." We'd speak every month, never long conversations, just enough to check in. He didn't offer advice or solutions. He asked me questions no one else did. When he passed away last month, it wasn't unexpected. He'd been in hospice for a while, but the invitation to the reading of his will surprised me. And even more surprising was the line, "Your presence is of particular importance." That phrase sat on my desk for a week. I wasn't going to go. I'd skipped Christmas for the last 2 years and heard no complaints. But something about that sentence made me book a flight. I told no one I was coming. Showed up in a charcoal gray dress I'd worn once to a city council meeting. Drove a borrowed rental past the ivy-covered gates. And when I pulled up to the circular driveway of the family estate, the same house I used to run through barefoot as a kid, I felt nothing, no nerves, no excitement, just quiet, like the air before a summer storm. They were already seated when I walked in. My parents didn't stand. Clara gave me a professional nod. Julian raised his eyebrows, clearly amused. The lawyer, Harold Knox, greeted me with warmth, but his eyes lingered a moment too long, like he knew something no one else did. I sat. I stayed quiet. And I listened to a parade of bequests roll out like a slow leak: paintings, properties, vacation shares, investment portfolios. My mother was given the historical artwork collection. My father received the vineyard estate in Napa. Clara took over the legal foundation. Julian got something called Turner Digital IP. I assumed I would get nothing, or perhaps a dusty box of books. So when Harold cleared his throat and said, "As for the full controlling interest in the Turner Legacy Trust, the gallery, and the historic preservation arm," and then looked directly at me, I didn't understand what he meant. But when the lawyer opened the envelope, everything I thought I knew about this family shattered in silence. Harold didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his glasses, glanced around the room, and read it like he was announcing the weather. I, Henry Charles Knox, leave full controlling interest in the Turner Legacy Trust, including ownership of the Gallery District, the Preservation Endowment, and the Turner House Archives, to my granddaughter, Sophie Elaine Turner. His voice didn't waver. Neither did mine, but only because I hadn't yet registered that he was talking about me. The first thing I noticed wasn't the words, it was the shift in the room, like air being sucked from a vacuum. Julian stopped drumming his fingers on the polished table. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. My mother blinked once, slowly, while my father leaned forward just enough to suggest disbelief without full commitment. They didn't look at me. They looked at Harold, then back at one another, as if waiting for someone else to clarify that this had been a mistake, a misprint, a paragraph meant for a different Sophie entirely. Julian was the first to break. Wait, what he asked, not to Harold, but to the room itself, like it might echo back a correction. She's getting the trust. Since when does Sophie even care about the family foundation? Clara didn't speak, but her brows had drawn together in the way they always did when she was recalculating a strategy. My father shifted back in his chair, that familiar gesture he used when meetings didn't go according to plan. "This isn't what we discussed," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Sophie hasn't been involved in Turner business, ever. She's not qualified to manage this kind of legacy." My mother's tone was cooler, clipped at the edges. "I'm sure there's more to it. Harold, maybe you should reread that portion." Harold set the document down and folded his hands neatly. "Mr. Knox's wishes are clearly stated. The will has been signed, witnessed, notarized, and filed in accordance with Georgia state law. There is no ambiguity here." He paused, then added, "There is also a video message Mr. Knox recorded to be played immediately after the reading." The assistant near the window stood, walked to a small screen mounted on the wall, and pressed play. My grandfather appeared on screen. Seated in the study I remembered from my childhood, the one with the worn leather chair and the faint smell of cigar smoke embedded in the drapes. He looked older than the last time I saw him, but his voice still carried the same deliberate cadence. "If you're hearing this," he began, "then I've passed on, and Harold has just informed you of my decision. I imagine there are some strong feelings in the room." He smiled faintly, but there was no trace of mockery. "I want to explain why I did what I did, because for once, no one can interrupt me while I speak." A few heads turned. My grandfather continued, eyes steady, voice growing firmer. "For the past decade, I've watched, quietly, deliberately, I've taken note of who shows up and why, not just to dinners and parties, but to people. I saw who returned my calls when there was no inheritance at stake, who helped others when there was no gain. I saw who used the Turner name as leverage and who walked away from it out of principle. Most of you know which side of that line you stand on. I didn't ask for perfection. I asked for decency. And the only person in this family who consistently showed it was Sophie. I heard my name and still didn't move. She never tried to impress me. She never begged for inclusion. She lived her life with quiet clarity, and while some of you dismissed it as small or insignificant, I saw it for what it was: honest, unpretentious stewardship. That's what this legacy needs. Not flash, not strategy, not self-preservation. The screen faded to black, and the room remained still. Julian stood up too fast, knocking his chair slightly off balance. He wasn't in his right mind when he made that video. He was sick, confused. This can't stand. My father's voice cut in, more dangerous in its restraint. We'll contest it. There's precedent. We can bring in medical experts, document his decline. My mother stayed seated, but her eyes were burning holes through Harold. You should have told us this. You let us walk in here blind. Harold didn't flinch. Mr. Knox anticipated this. That's why he included a clause. Any attempt to challenge the will by a named beneficiary results in total forfeiture of that person's inheritance. Julian sat back down hard. Clara's jaw twitched. My father leaned back with the look of someone calculating the PR cost of outrage. I hadn't said a word, not until that moment. I didn't know. I said quietly, "He never told me any of this. I came here thinking I'd be lucky to get a letter or a keepsake." My mother finally turned to face me. "You expect us to believe that this was just dropped in your lap and you had no idea I didn't respond to the tone. It wasn't a plan. He treated me like I mattered. That's it. That's all I ever got from him. And apparently, that was enough." Julian laughed again, but no one joined him this time. My father stood and walked to the far end of the room, then turned back toward me. "You'll never hold this together. You're not ready for this kind of responsibility. Not with your experience. Not with your background." I looked at him and said the only thing that felt real in that moment. Maybe I'm not, but I didn't choose this. He did, and in that instant, I understood that what just happened couldn't be undone. Whether I wanted it or not, everything had changed. I left the reading as if I'd just been pushed off a ledge into cold water. No one followed me, no one stopped me, and no one called out my name. The people who had spent a lifetime walking 3 steps ahead of me now sat in stunned silence, recalibrating their status, while I slipped quietly out of the family estate. I didn't look back. I walked straight to my rental car, turned the key with a hand that didn't quite feel like mine, and drove away from the house where I'd once eaten Sunday waffles in my pajamas and now, apparently, owned by legal decree, I thought I'd feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt hollow. Back at the small hotel I'd booked near Chippewa Square, I unlocked the room and stood just inside the doorway for a full minute before I moved. It was modest, with bare wood floors and a thin bedspread, but it had privacy, and at that moment, privacy felt like luxury. I pulled off my shoes slowly, peeled off the blazer I'd worn more to shield myself than to look polished, and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on a light. The late afternoon sun spilled through the shuttered windows like a secret trying to get in. On the desk was a cream-colored envelope I hadn't seen before. My name was handwritten in blue ink, careful and unmistakable. Sophie, open only when the dust has started to settle. I didn't remember who handed it to me, maybe Harold's assistant, Or maybe someone had slipped it into the room earlier. I stared at it for a few long seconds, then opened it with the precision of someone who had once traced her grandfather's signature onto cardboard when she was 9 years old. The letter was short, no flowery language, no elaborate justification, just his voice, quiet and clear, in every line, if you're reading this. Then everything has already started moving, he wrote. And if you feel overwhelmed, that's normal. I expected that. I've prepared not only assets, but also notes, instructions, and the things I never had time to teach. You'll find everything in the brown folder locked in the gallery basement. The code is the day you got your MIT scholarship. I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I needed to recall the number, but because I hadn't realized he'd remembered it. In a family that made a ceremony of every Ivy League acceptance or public award. The day I got that letter had come and gone without anyone mentioning it. He had remembered. He had quietly marked it. I opened my eyes and continued reading. I know you didn't ask for this, and that's exactly why you're the only one I could trust with it. Don't try to fit into their mold. Don't play their game. They will test you. Sophie. They will make you doubt yourself. But integrity doesn't need applause. It just needs time. I folded the letter gently and placed it on the nightstand. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel vindicated. I just felt alone in protecting me from the weight of this family for years. He had also left me standing at the center of the storm, without warning, but he had been right about one thing. I hadn't asked for this, and because of that, I owed no one an apology, not for the inheritance, not for the choices he made, and certainly not for being the quiet one. That night, I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop and started combing through every public document I could find about the Turner Legacy Trust, the Gallery Fund, the preservation sites, and the nonprofit entities now legally under my control. What I found didn't scare me because of their complexity. It scared me because of how much of them were still intertwined with the people who had spent years pretending I didn't exist. Clara had overseen many of the trust's legal approvals. Julian had been listed as a creative advisor for Turner Digital. My mother still sat on the board of the Turner Arts Fund, even if I legally held the keys. Every hallway of this house still echoed their footsteps, and I wasn't sure yet whether I was supposed to sweep them out or learn how to walk differently. At just after 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. Not another email, not a news alert, a call. I almost ignored it, assuming it was one of the many numbers that had been flooding my screen since that afternoon, but something made me answer. Sophie. The voice was calm, crisp. Clara. I hadn't heard her speak directly to me in over a year. We need to talk. Soon. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just held the phone to my ear for a moment longer than necessary and listened to the quiet that followed. When Clara called again the next morning, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her tone was brisk, rehearsed, the way she used to speak to me before piano recitals when I missed a note. Meet me at the Ridley office downtown, conference room B, noon. I didn't confirm. I just said, I'll be there, and hung up. I didn't know what she wanted, but I knew it wasn't coffee or closure. The Ridley building sat in the heart of the historic district, an old bank-turned-law office, lined with iron railings and red brick. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than it was. As I stepped into the glass-walled conference room, I saw Clara already seated at the head of the table, laptop open, hair tied back in her usual severe knot, her blazer pressed to perfection. She didn't stand when I entered. Sit, she said, like a surgeon calling a resident to observe. I sat, no makeup, no defense, no pretense. She looked me over like she was still adjusting to the idea that I was no longer just her younger sister, but her legal superior. "We need to talk through the foundation holdings," she began, tapping a folder toward me. "There are legal timeframes, filings due, endowments needing signatures. If you're planning to take this seriously, you'll need to get up to speed fast." I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she paused, I said, "Why are you really here?" That stopped her. For just a second, I saw the edge of her mask slip. "Because," she finally said, her voice lower, "if you mess this up." None of us survived the fallout. I let the words settle. "You mean financially?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Reputationally." I nodded slowly. "I didn't ask for this. Clara, I didn't campaign for it. I didn't even know he'd written me in. But you accepted it," she said, eyes sharp. "And now it's real. So stop acting like a shocked intern and start acting like a Turner." That last part landed differently. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. I stood without replying. "I'll review everything, and I'll decide what needs to stay and what doesn't." Clara blinked, then leaned back in her chair. "You're making this personal." "It was personal before I got here," I said, walking to the door. "You all just hid it under professionalism. I didn't slam the door. I didn't storm off. But when I reached the street, I took a breath that felt like the first full inhale in days. That afternoon, I drove to the Turner Gallery alone. No press, no entourage, just me and a small bag with a notebook, gloves, and the code Grandpa left me. The building had always intimidated me, all limestone and black iron, with a fountain that never worked properly. But today it felt different, like a place paused in time, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. The security guard recognized my name and let me in without question. I took the elevator down to the basement, a space that once held overflow sculptures and now functioned as a private archive. I found the brown folder in a locked drawer exactly where the letter had said. Inside were blueprints, old contracts, handwritten notes in the margins, names of donors, whispered scandals, property loopholes, and a single paper-clipped page with my name at the top. At the bottom, in Grandpa's careful handwriting, it read, "This is not a gift. This is an invitation to rebuild." I sat on the cold metal stool and read every page. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't think about the next board meeting. I thought about the way he used to point out flaws in public structures, not to criticize, but to imagine how to fix them. I thought about the time he told me buildings are like people. Some just need restoration instead of demolition. And then I found the blueprint, folded, labeled, dated. It wasn't just a drawing. It was his final design, an integration of gallery space, public housing, and education center, all rooted in the same neighborhood where the original Turner offices had stood a century ago. The plans were complete, but unsigned. In the margin, a post-it note said simply, "Need someone who sees past the facade." I didn't know yet if I was that person, but I knew I was the only one holding the key now, and for the first time, the idea didn't scare me. The emails started 2 days later. Then came the phone calls. Then the visits. At first, they arrived in order. A politely worded email from Julian, full of buzzwords and links to past campaigns he claimed to have helped build. A spreadsheet titled revenue growth potential, as if sending me Excel cells could erase a decade of neglect. I didn't reply. Next came my mother, her message beginning with "darling" and ending with "we are so proud of you," a phrase I'd only ever heard directed toward Clara. Attached to it was a PDF file with the subject line, "Suggested Board Appointments." It was a list of names she'd already pre-selected to support your transition. Not advise, not guide, control. I let it sit in my inbox. Clara's follow-up came through her firm, a legal brief disguised as a personal note, citing tax deadlines and liability exposure if the foundation's reporting lagged beyond the next quarter. Julian tried again with a voicemail this time, his tone fake casual, reminding me of how he covered for me at Thanksgiving in 2018 when I was too sick to fly home. "You owe me a beer at least," he said, like we were old friends and not strangers bound by blood and legacy. Then came my father. He didn't call or write. He showed up. I was in the archive room again, reviewing land records for the gallery property when the guard told me a Mr. David Turner had arrived. I asked them to hold him in the lobby. I didn't rush. I took my time placing the documents back in their file, straightened the post-it Grandpa had left me, then walked up the stone stairs like I owned the place, because, technically, I did. My father stood with perfect posture, hands folded behind his back, wearing a blazer tailored to his exact shoulder width. He smiled, the same politician's smile he used when the press asked about community outreach. "Sophie," he said, like the past week had been an inconvenience rather than a collapse. I greeted him with a nod, nothing more. "May we talk?" he asked. "You already are." He chuckled, dry and short. "Fair enough. I've been thinking about what Henry did, about how sudden it was, and I think we can agree this situation needs managing." I didn't respond. I looked down at the folder but didn't open it. "Did you offer Clara a transition folder when she made partner?" I asked. His expression hardened. "That's different." I nodded. "It always is." I handed the folder back. "I won't sign away something I didn't ask for, just to make everyone else more comfortable." He looked disappointed but not surprised. "Then you'll need to be prepared for what happens next, when people realize you're not as cooperative as they hoped." I stared at him evenly. "You raised me to be quiet, but you never taught me to be weak." That ended the conversation. He left without a handshake, and I stood in the lobby watching him cross the square like a man exiting a courtroom where the verdict hadn't gone his way. That night, I opened the file Grandpa had marked with a red tab labeled Press and Politics. Inside were emails, memos, and newspaper drafts never published. There was a strategy he had once mapped out with a PR firm but never launched. It detailed what would happen if the foundation leadership ever fell into the wrong hands. He had never used it. Instead, he'd waited, observed, and passed the pen to me. I closed the folder and walked to the gallery's main hall, where the lights had just been turned off, in the quiet space. The walls felt less like monuments and more like mirrors. This wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about identity. I had a choice. I could try to manage their expectations, soften the shift, include them for the sake of peace, or I could break the cycle. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me which path was easier, but I didn't come here looking for easy. I came because I couldn't keep pretending my silence had no cost. I walked back to my hotel, sat at the desk, and wrote one sentence on a clean page. Effective immediately. All pending board appointments are on hold, pending independent review. I signed it, dated it, and emailed it to Harold for legal notation. Then I sat back, closed the laptop, and let the weight of my own decision settle into the room. I wasn't finished. I was just beginning. The next week passed in small, deliberate steps. I moved into a temporary apartment above the gallery, a space once used for visiting artists, but now mostly filled with extra lighting equipment and forgotten paperwork. It wasn't glamorous. The pipes rattled, the floor creaked in the mornings, but it allowed me to be close to what mattered and far from the noise I didn't need. I woke early and walked the building every day before the staff arrived, memorizing layouts, listening to how the old walls held sound, how the light fell across the marble when the sun hit just right. I met with department heads one by one, not to give orders, but to ask questions. I learned names. I remembered them. I asked people how long they'd worked there and what they wished someone in charge would finally notice. Most of them looked confused at first, then cautiously relieved. One woman, Diane from Archives, told me no one had asked her opinion in 12 years. She cried after our conversation and apologized for it. I told her not to. Harold sent regular updates. Legal filings were in motion. The Trust's authority had transferred completely. The documents were airtight, but the resistance wasn't legal. It was cultural. Every week, someone new leaked a rumor to the press, questioning my readiness, my background, even my mental health. An anonymous editorial titled, "From Art Student to Heiress, Can a Dreamer Manage a Legacy?" ran in one of the regional magazines. I knew exactly who had written it. Even if the byline said staff contributor, Julian hadn't called since our last exchange, but his fingerprints were all over the tone. I didn't respond. I didn't issue a statement. Instead, I asked the gallery's media coordinator, a man named Luis, to help me draft a letter for the quarterly newsletter. It wasn't a press release, just a message of clarity. I wrote that the Turner Trust was moving toward accessibility, transparency, and architectural restoration as civic practice. I invited community input. I opened a submission portal for public art ideas that aligned with education and environmental sustainability. Within 72 hours, we received over 400 responses. 2 days later, a local elementary school principal emailed me directly. She'd seen the gallery's call for proposals and wondered if a group of her fifth graders could come tour the space and present drawings for a mural on one of the exterior walls. I said yes. The same afternoon, I signed a motion to reallocate a portion of the donor fund toward free programming for public school students within Chatham County. I didn't ask permission. I didn't ask anyone to co-sign. I reviewed the bylaws and did it myself. That night, I stood alone in the empty main hall and stared up at the skylight Grandpa had once described as too grand for its own good. I whispered a sentence I hadn't said aloud until then. "You gave me this for a reason. I'm trying not to waste it." That weekend, I received a text from Clara. Just 4 words. "I underestimated you. Coffee." I didn't respond right away. I let it sit for a day, not out of spite, but out of caution. Then I said yes. We met at a cafe neither of us had been to before, one tucked behind a bookstore, the kind of place with uneven tables and chipped ceramic mugs. She arrived in casual clothes, no briefcase, no papers. Her hair was down. She ordered tea. I watched her like I was watching someone speak a new dialect of a familiar language. "I don't like being wrong," she said. But I was. I didn't reply. She kept going. "You're doing things I never would have risked. It's reckless, but it's also working." I sipped my coffee and said, "I'm not here to be safe. I'm here to make this matter again." Clara nodded slowly. "If you want someone to double-check your contracts, I'm available." Quietly, no strings. I believed her. Not because she had changed, but because she was beginning to understand that change was happening whether she liked it or not. Later that night, I received an email from Luis. The story about the school mural had been picked up by 2 regional news outlets and shared over 2,000 times. A local artist had offered to help mentor the students. The city council had requested a meeting to talk about additional sites for educational public art. I sat back in my chair and read the email twice. Not because I didn't believe it, but because part of me had forgotten what it felt like to see something grow without being torn down first. I wasn't done proving myself, but for the first time, I felt the ground beneath me holding firm. The morning after the mural story broke, I arrived at the gallery early, expecting nothing more than a quiet hour to review donor reports before the staff meeting. Instead, I found Luis standing in the hallway outside the main office with a look I'd never seen on him before. His arms were crossed, face pale, shoulders stiff like he'd been bracing for something that had already happened. "Someone accessed the donor portal," he said, voice low. There were unauthorized edits. A few fake names were inserted, and a couple of legitimate ones were removed. I took a breath, held it, and asked the only question that mattered. "How bad?" He swallowed. "Bad enough that if we hadn't caught it in the log history, it would have passed compliance review next month, which would have triggered a financial flag, which, if picked up by media, would have looked like internal fraud." I nodded once, not because I understood every technical piece, but because I understood the pattern. When influence slips, sabotage fills the vacuum. "Do we know who did it?" I asked. Luis hesitated. "It came from Julian's old login, deactivated but somehow re-enabled. We're tracing how. Could have been him or someone working with his access." I didn't panic. I didn't call Harold. I asked Luis to restore the log, isolate the breach, and prepare a quiet notice to the board explaining the correction before it became a headline. Then I went to the archive room and sat with the brown folder again, the one Grandpa had labeled behavioral patterns. I hadn't read that section in full yet. Part of me hadn't wanted to. I wasn't sure if knowing would give me clarity or just feed resentment. But now, I needed to understand the system I had inherited, not just in title, but in tone. The pages weren't formal records. They were observations, paragraphs scribbled in his handwriting. Julian brilliant in short bursts, reactive under pressure, deeply afraid of being forgotten. Watch how he handles proximity to power that isn't his. Another entry under Clara's name described her as efficient to a fault, slow to trust, capable of loyalty if shown purpose rather than control. And then there was a section marked simply, David and Elizabeth, my parents. His note underlined a single phrase 3 times. They see legacy as protection. They do not believe in vulnerability. This will be their downfall. I closed the folder and leaned back in the chair. For years, I'd thought I was the disappointment, the child with the wrong ambition. But he had been watching all along, not with judgment, but with the patience of someone waiting for the right conditions to plant something new. When I returned upstairs, Luis had already issued the internal notice and locked the compromised access. No one had asked for headlines. They didn't need to. The message was clear. I wasn't a placeholder anymore. I was a firewall. That evening, I walked to the bookstore cafe again, Not to meet Clara this time, but to clear my head. I ordered tea, sat in the back corner, and opened my notebook. I didn't write a speech or a mission statement. I wrote 3 questions. What am I protecting? Who am I becoming? What am I willing to lose? I was still staring at the page when someone slid into the seat across from me. I looked up and saw Tyler, my cousin, my father's sister's son. He used to be the one adult at family events who'd sneak me a cookie or tell a dumb joke just to make me laugh. We hadn't spoken in almost 4 years. I figured you'd be here, he said. Not awkward, just honest. Saw the press story. Read the board memo. Thought you handled it clean. I didn't know what to say, so I just said, thanks. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket. Julian's been shopping around a document. Claims he found language in the original trust that allows for forced reassessment if the heir is deemed incapable. Wants to trigger a competency review. Says it's just contingency planning, but he's already talking to Harold's competitors. I took the paper without reacting, read it in silence, then asked, "Why are you telling me this?" Tyler shrugged. "Because I don't like bullies, and I've seen you eat them alive lately. Quietly. That's a skill." I looked him in the eye. "What do you want in return?" He smiled. "Just a seat at the new table. No deals. Just a chance to help build something that doesn't rot from the inside." Later that night, I walked back through the gallery in the dark, the blueprint folded under my arm, and Tyler's warning still fresh in my mind. The marble glowed under the moonlight that filtered through the skylight, casting everything in soft gray lines. I didn't feel victorious, but I no longer felt uncertain. They could keep leaking, scheming, rewriting rules in shadows. I had my name on the deed, my feet on the floor, and one truth they could never undo. I didn't get here by accident. I got here because someone believed I would make the hard choices, and I was ready to prove them right. The day we reopened the gallery under its new model, it rained without stopping, not the kind of dramatic storm that makes headlines, but a soft, persistent drizzle that made the air feel heavier than it should have. Still, people came. They arrived with umbrellas and damp coats, trailing children and curiosity. I watched from the mezzanine as students hung their drawings on the west wall, the same wall that used to display oil portraits of Turner family patriarchs. Now it held sketches of gardens, housing pods, and painted dreams from 5th graders who'd never been inside the building until that week. Louise had coordinated everything, and Clara, despite herself, had helped rewrite the donor acknowledgement format to include individual educators and mentors instead of just legacy surnames. We didn't host a press conference. There was no ribbon to cut, but at noon, we opened the doors, and something in the energy shifted. People didn't whisper like they were in a museum. They spoke. They asked questions. They lingered. And somewhere between the laughter of children echoing in the atrium and the quiet nods of older residents recognizing photos of forgotten neighborhoods on the east exhibit wall, I realized we'd already won something. Midway through the afternoon, I stepped into my office for the first real break in days and found a package on my desk. No label, no envelope, just a flat, wrapped bundle and a small card that read, "From the storage vault." He meant to finish it. Inside was one of Grandpa's paintings, a landscape, half complete. Bold strokes shaped the lower half of a city skyline, but the top faded into pencil marks and faint gestures. On the back, written in the same small lettering, I'd seen in the archive files. He had written, "Meant to finish together." I set the painting against the wall and stared at it for a long time. I knew he hadn't meant it literally. We were never meant to collaborate on the canvas. He meant this, the building, the idea, the turning over of the brush. He'd started something that only someone outside the system could finish without it becoming corrupted again. That evening, I walked home slowly, umbrella closed at my side, letting the light rain sink into my coat. When I reached my building, the doorman handed me a letter. This one wasn't anonymous. It was from my mother, a simple ivory envelope, handwritten in her unmistakable script. I didn't open it immediately. I waited until the apartment was quiet, until the lights were low and the outside world felt far enough away that I could face what was inside. The letter wasn't long. It didn't apologize, but it didn't defend itself either. It read like a woman trying, for the first time, to speak without performance. "I didn't understand why he chose you," she wrote. "For years, I assumed he would leave everything to David or Clara or the foundation board. But now I see it. He didn't choose you because you were loud. He chose you because you listened. I don't know how to undo what I never realized I was doing, but I see now that I failed you, not by disapproving, but by not seeing you at all." I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because I didn't expect it. I folded it and placed it inside the journal he had left me, between the entries on loyalty and legacy, not as proof, just as something true. The next day, I met with Harold to review the final stage of the transition. The advisory council was confirmed. The trust bylaws had been updated to include term limits and transparency audits. We finalized a plan to donate a portion of underutilized properties back to the city for community development. As we were wrapping up, Harold slid a folder across the table. "There's one more thing," he said. "Your grandfather requested this be shared with you once you had fully taken office." Inside was a list, not of people or properties, but of small acts, kindnesses, repairs. Every time I had helped a neighbor, every time I'd visited a sick professor, every time I'd sent artwork to a student who couldn't afford materials. It wasn't surveillance. It was love recorded in ink. He had been watching not for mistakes, but for character. And in that moment, I realized the most powerful form of legacy isn't what you leave behind, but how quietly you shape the world when no one is looking. I left Harold's office feeling neither powerful nor triumphant. I felt steady, and in a world that had never wanted me to feel that way. It was enough. The Turner Foundation had become something else entirely, something built not on ego or tradition, but on usefulness. It didn't erase the years of silence, but it repurposed them. And as I walked through the square that evening, the rain had stopped, the air had cleared, and for once, no one was watching, but I still walked with my head up, not because I needed to be seen, but because I no longer needed to hide. 3 weeks after the gallery reopened, I received an invitation to a private arbitration meeting. Julian had officially challenged the trust on the basis of administrative incompetence. He claimed that the transition had been mismanaged, citing emotional instability and lack of executive training. The language was rehearsed, the phrasing designed to sound legal, but anyone who read it could see what it really was: desperation repackaged as concern. Harold had warned me that this might come, what none of us expected, though, was that Julian would demand the meeting be held at the original Turner estate. the place our grandfather had left to the city as a public arts retreat. When we arrived, Julian and his attorney were already seated on the back patio, which overlooked the reflection pond my grandfather had helped dig himself in the 1970s. It was a ridiculous setting for a legal review, but I sat calmly, folder in hand, and let them begin. Julian launched into a monologue about fiduciary duty, strategic planning gaps, and reputational harm to the family's legacy. I let him speak. He needed to believe he was still in control of the narrative. When he finally paused, I opened my folder and passed out 3 documents. The first was a quarterly audit from the board's independent financial review, showing a 27% increase in operational efficiency since the restructuring. The second was a letter from the Department of Community Arts confirming our new education programs had doubled local engagement in under-resourced schools. The third was a personal note from Harold, stating that, under the trust's legal framework, I was the sole designated heir unless proven grossly negligent or criminally liable, neither of which had even remotely occurred. The air grew still. Julian didn't speak again for a full minute. Then his attorney leaned over and whispered something. I didn't catch it, but whatever it was, it made Julian's jaw clench and his eyes drift toward the pond. I just thought it was mine, he said finally, the sharpness gone from his voice. I thought I was the one being prepared for all this. I could have corrected him. I could have reminded him that while he was hosting gala dinners and collecting press mentions, I was doing the silent work of listening, repairing, and bridging gaps no one else saw. But I didn't. I just looked at him and said, you were being prepared for applause. I was being prepared for responsibility. He didn't argue. He just stood, nodded at no one in particular, and walked off the property like a man realizing the door he kept pushing had already been locked from the inside. That night, I returned to my apartment and opened the final sealed envelope from the original box Harold had given me. Inside was a letter dated 6 months before Grandpa's passing. It wasn't addressed to me by name. It simply began with, to the one who chooses the harder path. The letter explained his decision to step away from traditional succession and allow the trust to evolve beyond bloodline. Legacy isn't about control, he wrote. It's about what outlives our ego. You were never meant to be the loudest voice. You were meant to be the one who listens when everyone else is performing. I read the letter slowly, then again, letting the words settle like weight finally lifting off my chest. It wasn't vindication, it was clarity. The following week, I invited the board, the staff, and all key community partners to a private dinner in the gallery's new multi-use space. We served food from local vendors and displayed artwork from youth centers, not high-end collectors. There were no assigned seats, no staged speeches, just quiet connection. Before the night ended, I stood up, not at a podium, just beside the food table, and raised a glass. This place was built on history, I said, but from this point forward, it will grow on trust, not the legal kind, the kind you earn by showing up, by listening, by staying when things get quiet and uncomfortable. We're not here to protect a name. We're here to give it new meaning. There was no applause, just a collective silence that didn't feel empty. It felt understood. After the guests left, I stood alone in the space for a moment longer. The lights dimmed to soft amber. The echo of conversation still hummed faintly in the air. I walked toward the east wall, where we had framed the half-finished painting Grandpa left me. Beside it, we'd added a small plaque with a line he wrote in the journal I now kept by my bed. What we leave unfinished is sometimes the most honest thing we offer. I didn't feel triumphant, but I felt complete, and that was enough. 1 year after the will reading, I stood again in the same glass-walled conference room that had once felt suffocating. This time, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a beginning, outside. The city moved at its usual pace. Buses sighed at red lights. Commuters checked their phones. A child chased a pigeon through the plaza. But inside that room, something had shifted. The people seated across from me weren't lawyers or relatives. They were artists, teachers, urban planners, nonprofit founders, people who had once stood at the margins and now sat at the table. I hadn't just inherited a trust. I had inherited a responsibility to dismantle what no longer served and rebuild something that might. That morning, I introduced the Turner Civic Fellowship, an annual program awarding grants to individuals creating community-based solutions in overlooked neighborhoods, not because it looked good in a press release, but because I had once lived with the ache of invisibility, and I knew what it meant to finally be seen. When I finished my brief speech, I glanced at the chair where my grandfather used to sit during board meetings. It was empty now, but I didn't feel alone. I felt connected to a version of him that had stopped pretending legacy was about lineage and started realizing it was about impact. After the event, as people shook my hand and shared their projects, someone asked me quietly, "Do your family members still talk to you?" I smiled gently and replied, "Some do, some don't, but I don't carry their silence like shame anymore." I didn't explain the details. I didn't mention that Julian had tried to sue the trust before ultimately walking away. I didn't mention that my mother had quietly sold her estate shares and moved to Arizona without saying goodbye. I didn't mention that Clara had written a letter thanking me for protecting what she now realized none of them deserved by default, because those weren't the endings that mattered. What mattered was what I had learned in the silence between their choices, that forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion, that love without accountability is just manipulation in costume, that sometimes healing is choosing not to go back, even when the door is wide open. By the end of that year, we had funded 13 community restoration initiatives. One of them transformed an abandoned library into a public storytelling studio. Another trained formerly incarcerated women in architectural drafting. We weren't just building things. We were rethreading narratives that had been unraveled by neglect. And in the quiet evenings after each board review, I would sit by the wide windows of my office, sipping tea and staring out at the skyline. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, not in victory, but in clarity. I had once been the daughter they barely introduced. Now, I was the woman behind the signature that released millions into hands that deserved trust, not pity, not permission, just trust. On the anniversary of my grandfather's passing, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small photo, an old one of us sitting on a bench by the river when I was maybe 7 or 8. I was holding a notebook in my lap, probably rambling about an imaginary museum I wanted to build. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note in his script: "Don't ask for the seat. Build the table." I stared at that line for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just exhaled and placed the photo beside my desk. That line didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a quiet torch passed, long before anyone realized the match had been lit. Today, people sometimes ask why I still use the Turner name, why I didn't drop it after everything that happened. I tell them it's not because I owe the name anything. It's because I've changed what it means for the longest time. It was a surname worn like a badge by people who believed blood equaled entitlement. Now, it belongs to murals, grants, youth programs, and community gardens. It belongs to the future, not the past, and sometimes, when I see the Turner logo on a banner outside a restored theater or on a free workshop poster for young creators, I don't think about Julian, or my mother, or the rooms that once dismissed me. I think about that version of me on the river bench, still scribbling, still imagining, still believing that stories can rebuild what pride once broke. Maybe that's what legacy really is, not what you leave behind for people who expected it, but what you build quietly, intentionally, for those who never saw it coming and needed it most. And maybe the real question isn't who inherits the fortune. Maybe the real question is who inherits the future.